Welcome to Diabetes Primetime. Today I'm speaking with Luis Mojica about taking a somatic approach to binge eating, overeating, and cravings. Luis is a somatic educator and trauma therapist who helps people find safety within themselves. You can learn more about Luis and the programs that he offers at holisticlifenavigation.com. Luis, thanks so much for being here with us today.
I was so excited when I saw it was you I was gonna be with.
So, I wanted to have you on the show because you take a very different approach to addiction and binge eating than most people do. You say that any addiction, whatever it is about trying to find safety within ourselves. Tell us about that.
Yes, so when we think about addiction and the lens I see it through with finding safety, we're really talking about a biology. So every addictive substance or food or thought or behavior creates some kind of biochemical change in our bodies. There's these kind of 3 states I'm always seeing the body trying to be in. It's a stimulated state, a depressed state, or something that's modulating. It's like the flexibility of going up and down, up and down. So when a body is unable to modulate for what any ever the reason is, and let's say it's stuck in being stimulated or it's stuck in being depressed, most people have some kind of implicit movement toward a substance or a food or a television show or even a relationship that will create stimulation or depression to kind of balance wherever they're stuck inside. So when I'm talking about finding safety, I'm talking about actually manipulating your biochemistry somehow to get the opposite effect of what your baseline is. So if I'm anxious and I'm stimulated, I'm going to tend towards something that lowers that and depresses me. If I'm really depressed and kind of low energy and fatigue, I move towards something that stimulates me. So these external addictions are temporarily giving us an opposition to our baseline, and then we feel a sense of balance, but it's temporary because it's being manipulated. It's not actually nourishing balance.
I love this perspective. And you talk about the innate intelligence of addiction because I think that's very different than the way a lot of us think about it. We beat ourselves up. We hate ourselves for turning to that pizza or turning to that cannabis or alcohol, whatever it is, at the end of the evening. But what you're saying is the body's really trying to do something very intelligent in order to reach that sense of balance it's craving.
It is, and I'm glad you call it the innate intelligence of addiction because it's sophisticated, and I like seeing it through that lens because not only do we destigmatize it, but we unshame ourselves from it, which gives us a lot more actual agency to work with it and see it for what it is, which is some intelligent, sophisticated impulse to try to shift your biology because you don't know how to otherwise. And so when we talk about a biology of safety, we're talking about one where the system can function so you can focus on things, you can connect to the world around you, maybe you can accomplish things as was stimulants help us do. And for some people, it's lowering the heart rate, breathing a little deeper, not feeling a tension in the body. So that there's a physiology of what I call safety. Safety to me is not an external environment, it's the body's ability to pick up on whatever the external environment is. So when we're thinking of addiction as an innate intelligence, we're seeing it as I'm seeing it as a mechanism. So not as like a behavioral flaw or a disease, but a mechanism to which the body is trying to find some equilibrium. It's like desperate for equilibrium. And equilibrium or balance biologically feels like safety. You make less adrenaline, you feel more settled in yourself, you can digest food, you can sleep. All these things that help the body actually function biologically comes from that biology of safety. The opposite would be a biology of stress or a biology of trauma where you're adrenalized.
So let's talk about how we find that equilibrium without the substances. Like, how do you help people find that balance naturally?
There's so many things. That's such a lifestyle and such a change of thinking. I'm gonna say the first place I start is helping people sense their body. Because when you've been addicted to something and you've been actively using and in this case, for your audience, it would mostly be food we're talking about. And I come from 15 plus years of binge eating personally, so I relate. When you use food as a way to cope, what that really means is food replaces your ability to feel what you're holding. So if I'm holding grief, if I'm holding physical pain in my body from an injury or inflammation, if I'm very low and depressed, if I have anxiety, these things show up hormonally. They're physical experiences in our body that are very uncomfortable and unpleasant. So for me, I started, I mean, I think age 8 or 9, I discovered that I could binge eat. And by doing so, I wouldn't feel the huge panic that lived in my chest that kept me up at night. So every hour, almost on the hour, I'd have to eat tons of food to quell that anxiety. So that means since 9 years old or so, when I discovered that, until I don't know, my late 20s, early 30s, when I realized there was another way, I was practicing not feeling. So most of us who are adults that are trying to figure out, like, how do I stop being addicted to food? You actually have to start titrating in feeling your body again. Whereas most people start with getting rid of the food, but then they have no actual skill set in feeling what comes up when you get rid of the food. So you relapse over and over and over again, as I did for nearly 20 years. So I would say the first step is titrating in the ability to sense and feel and even be with the unpleasant sensations and emotions that drive the binging in the first place.
So I so relate to all of this. And I had a very, very similar story. A lot of binge eating just to deal with unpleasant feelings that would come up until about, gosh, probably 20 years ago. And what's interesting is even as the binging behavior falls away, the challenge with feeling the feelings is still there. So walk someone through. Let's say it's an evening. I've just got some unpleasant news. I'm feeling anxious and I'm feeling sad. It's triggering a lot that is bubbling up inside of me, and I don't know what to do with it. I want to turn to food. What might I begin to explore instead?
hmm So I have a practice I love called interrupting cravings. And I'll preface it by saying interrupting a craving or interrupting a habit of eating is different from eliminating or stopping the habit of eating. And I say that because my experience personally and with many people is that addiction is something that becomes obsolete when you learn how to create another option. If you just get rid of the addiction, you're abstaining, which is totally fine, especially when your life depends on your abstinence, but it's not actual recovery for me. Recovery is when we can do what you're suggesting. How do I feel the thing that comes up that would normally drive me to binge? So in this case, we interrupt the craving. You notice, and I'll think of myself, I'll notice, wow, I really want to go to the store and buy a bag of chips. That was my thing. It'd be chips with some kind of like fatty dip, is how it would begin. It would end with, a whole jar of peanut butter and many other things, but it would start with a bag of chips and some kind of dip. So I noticed the desire, I noticed the craving, the impulse. And what I would do is I'd set an alarm 10, 15 minutes, not more than that. And I would grab a pillow. So I always recommend people to have a pillow on their belly and chest if possible, if it's big enough. If not, just the belly. Then you take your hands, you put one hand on your chest, one hand over your belly with that pillow, in between your hand and your belly. Or you can cross your arms, but it usually feels really good to do the pressure on the chest and the belly. Now, there's a reason we do this. Just that pressure gives a certain support to the system that, let's say, the binge eating would give. So already it's prompting what we call down regulation. So the activation and anxiety that drives me to the chips has something to slow it and soothe it that isn't the chips, right? And it slows it and soothes it and supports it just enough for me to now come in and try supporting it along with the pillow. What does that mean? It means I'm holding this and I'm literally tracking the feeling that's moving me to the chips. And I start to notice, oh, my stomach, kind of, there's a clench there. It's like butterflies. Oh, it's rising into my chest. It's becoming, there's a lot of pressure there. Wow, I feel like I'm going to cry or freak out. And part of the work over time is how I let that move through me. Because if the cry wants to come, if I want to stretch, if I notice exhaustion, I need to lay down for 10 minutes. Those are the expressions that don't get to happen because the binging interrupts those. So, what we're actually learning when we interrupt the craving is when I binge, I interrupt a full expression my body wants to have that would actually end in me truly regulating and being at a place where now I feel safe in my body, which then makes the addiction obsolete. I don't need the chips when I feel safe. Or I might love to have 10 or 15 chips, but I don't need the bag because I'm already from a equilibrium kind of balanced baseline. So it's more about interrupting it, learning what wants to move that never gets a chance to because I cut it off with binging. And then after I let it move, I learn what's there. I then see how I want to relate to the food that I was about to binge.
I love that as an example. And I'm reflecting on a story I've heard you tell where when you used to be a nutritionist, you had three women in 1 week come to you and you were recommending that they give up chocolate. And they each said, "Oh, I can't do that. If I gave up chocolate, I'd have to leave my husband." Tell us about your experience with people and the way you see food kind of is able to keep inconvenient truths at bay.
That was a turning point in my career and in my life because that was the moment I went back to school and started studying somatic psychology. Because I had started studying psychology and majoring in it. And then I didn't like the DSM because it was too identifying for my taste. It wasn't enough about what's beyond, like what's beneath the behaviors. I couldn't find alternative psychology at the time. It was just that. So I went into nutrition because nutrition was kind of like this shortcut to transform someone's mental health through the gut biome. And I thought, well, I can do in 3 months what would take me 30 years with a client in talk therapy. So I did that for a while. And then, like you said, in my private practice, in the same week, three women who did not know each other all came in with this intense sugar addiction, specifically with bars and bars of chocolate. We're not talking about a square of dark chocolate. We're talking about bars of milk chocolate. And their levels were going toward diabetes. So they were needing to drastically eliminate sugar, at least for now, while we rehabilitated their pancreas and such. And so when I suggested to them, well, let's look at the source of sugar, and they were all eating these loads of chocolate around 4 p.m. And I remember saying, like, what happens at 4 p.m.? They're like, oh, that's right before my husband gets home from work. All three of these women. I thought that's interesting. And I said, well, let's start with, and this is before I really studied somatics. I said, let's start reducing the chocolate. What would it be like if we did half or got a carob, some kind of replacement? So you have the ritual, but you're not getting all the sugar. And they all said in different sessions and different days, I'd have to leave my husband. And that was the light bulb moment. I realized, wow, food is actually giving us a way to bypass a boundary. Because without, like when you said, inconvenient truth, without the chocolate and sugar, they had nothing to remediate a real desire to leave this marriage. That was highly unsatisfying for all three of them. So we explored this over a couple weeks. The first two women dropped out. They didn't come back to my practice, I think, after 2 or 3 sessions. They were just like, nope, not going there. The third went there and she went hardcore. Like she eliminated, she went macrobiotics, she brought in beans, like she really did it. And I think it was 3 months after the diet, she successfully divorced her husband, moved out with her two kids, and lived in a townhouse very happily. Her entire life changed. And that was the moment, just she was really my teacher, and then I started applying this to everyone, is how our lives, our external relationships and environments and circumstances, they're sensational in our body. We have to have a certain amount of capacity to handle life. And capacity is biological. It's like your nervous system and your cells and your liver. All these things allow you to withstand the energy of big experiences. So her body, without the high of sugar and chocolate, would feel this depth of sorrow and longing for a life outside of her husband. But when she ate the chocolate, it took away the sorrow. Now, sorrow in this case, like sorrow and longing as a healthy side effect of let's say, a bad marriage, that's good. Like you want that. You want to feel a longing and a sorrow and a pain because that's your body saying, this isn't good for you. And then I would come to learn, for many, many years after that, how many of us remediate the signals, soothe away the signals with food that would actually drive us out of situations that no longer serve us. So essentially, food helps us break our boundaries and helps us numb out the feelings that come up to tell us what we actually need and what we need to do.
I love this as an example because I think for a lot of us, we turn to food because so many other things are forbidden. Like we may feel like we don't deserve rest, or we don't deserve joy, or we don't deserve play. But food feels like, I'm going to hate myself later, but this is allowed. How might someone begin to change that pattern internally and start opening themselves up to other emotions that may have previously felt scary?
I think that's why I like the practice of titrating in sensation because it's so important to remember when you have a reflexive kind of unconscious automatic relationship to food in this way where you binge or withhold both have different biochemistries and results that we were wanting unconsciously because of the pain we're in. When that's our reflex, that means we have a long-term practice of not feeling. So it's like when you can titrate in feeling, this is why I like the interrupting cravings practice all through the day. For me, I probably had 40, 50 cravings a day because I would binge so much. Those are 40, 50 moments to just pause and notice what's under the craving. Even for 2 minutes, if I don't have 10 minutes, maybe just 1 minute, 30 seconds. That starts titrating in the felt sense of what else lives in me. And then I start to feel more. I start to get more comfortable with feeling. I start to build a capacity for feeling. And then the food, interestingly enough, becomes a bridge, like the binging or whatever it is we do with our food. It becomes a bridge toward actual self-regulation because I'm giving those little titrations of uncomfortable sensation mixed with the pleasure of overeating or the numbness of overeating. So when the two exist together, eventually I start to feel a little more. I start to be able to be with my feelings a little more. And then the binging goes a little further down. And this is very natural. This is a natural pendulation the body does where it starts renegotiating its addiction to food without even a guide, without even saying reduce sugar, just by bringing in the awareness of sensation. Because for me, what happened is after I would say 3 or 4 years of doing this, I then was able to embody the act of binge eating, which is very dissociative for us. We're not usually feeling it when we're binging. We're kind of zoning out, we're watching TV, or we're not even remembering how we got to the bottom of the bag. So you're not fully there. You're physically numb while you're eating. When I embodied binging, it was shockingly uncomfortable. And I would have told you for like 20 years that I eat because I love food, that I eat because I love pleasure. I love taste. I wasn't getting any pleasure from this, but I didn't know that until I could embody the binging. So it kind of leads you there eventually.
I want you to explain a little bit more for our audience what titrating the feeling is. Talk about what that looks like.
So titrating is just a way of saying baby steps. So what I love about the pillow is it gives you a sense of support. And then when I say, what it looks like, if we go back to that interrupting cravings practice, you're feeling your emotions, sensations, thoughts, whatever's coming up. You're giving it a space to just focus on that for, like I said, 2 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever the ability is.
I'm even thinking 30 seconds for people who,
Yes.
who have really spent decades, as I did, not feeling their feelings. We might just be able to handle 30 seconds with the pillow, and then we turn to the food or TV or whatever it is
Yes.
we need to kind of like bridge the uncomfortable feeling. That's what you're talking about with using it as a bridge.
Yeah, literally, yes, it's the exact same thing as if I'm going to start training for a marathon. If I haven't run ever in my life and I want to run 5 miles, I have to start with just stretches. I can't even go running. So I start stretching my hamstrings and I get to a certain period where, oh, I can't bend over that far. It hurts. I have to stop. That's what we're doing here. We're stretching the amount of time we can withstand sitting with an emotion before we binge. And you're spot on. For some people, it's 5 seconds. They literally take a breath and then they eat. That's all they can handle. When you practice that more, when I say titrating, you're taking in almost like if you imagine like a beautiful colored dye dripping into water. You're bringing in a little more each time that you can handle, rather than what I did for years. Because my binging was also met with purging and detoxing. So I would binge for months, and then like strong elimination, strong withholding of food, binging, purging, detoxing, drinking herbal teas that were really rough on my liver to kind of like get all the stuff out that I put in. That did nothing for me, right? It was this constant back and forth dysregulation. So slowly feeling actually helped me stay in the binging. And then, let's say here's like the feeling in the binging. Feeling a little more, I'd binge a little less and it would start doing this, right? Versus cutting myself off completely, I would fly right back into binge eating because I had no capacity for the sensation of emotion. So the titrating in of the sensation to me literally means take a breath, set an alarm for 30 seconds, do 5 minutes. Maybe some people go to therapy. They need a whole session with a person to sit through and they imagine the craving, or they go there with the bag of chips. What we're trying to do is prompt the sensation that comes up right before we eat that we're usually unconscious to. We usually can't feel that. We don't even know it's there until we just pause. And then over time, you build up the capacity for the sensation more than you go right to the binging.
So I want to go back to what you said about binging being an associative act, and I would completely agree. That was my experience as well. But explain what you mean by that for folks watching at home who may not be clear on what dissociation is.
Yeah, dissociation is a very natural thing that the body does. It's a way that either the mind turns off, so we're not consciously here. So, those of you watching, you can think of those times you're really tired and you're driving home. It's the same road you've always driven on. And you're like, I don't remember the last 5 minutes of this drive. Like maybe you were listening to a radio, maybe you were thinking what you had to do at home. You didn't go through any red lights, somehow you got home safely, but you can't recall being there. That's a mental dissociation where your mind stopped connecting to where you were and the body kind of takes over, the reflex takes over. There's also the somatic dissociation where I can't feel anything. So here I am in the room, I'm looking around, I see where I am. I feel nothing. There's no sensations. I feel numb. I feel vacant. I don't even know I have a body. And then there's both. where we think of like a memory where we black something out. So I dissociate it mentally from being consciously aware of what happened. So I have no memory or image. And sensationally, I dissociate it. So I have no feelings attached to it. People can even say, "You just went through this horrible thing. I have no recollection of it." So when we're talking about binging, we're usually talking about that. I think for me, it was both. It depends on the individual, but you lose a track of a sense of where you are because the reflex becomes automatic. So my chip eating was just hand in, hand to mouth, hand in bag, hand to mouth. It's hypnotic. And I start to leave because I don't have to be conscious doing it. The body kind of takes over and it becomes a pattern. So I'm not feeling the chips going in and I'm not really in the room. I might be in my mind. I might be completely dissociated in terms of I don't even having any thoughts. I'm not even there at all. It's almost like I fell asleep while I was doing it. So dissociation is a lot like sleepwalking. And when you binge eat, you're usually in a highly dissociative state, right? Because it is hypnotic, it takes over so your mind can go elsewhere. And it's what allows you to binge eat. Because when I became associated with it, when I started sitting there and eating a whole bag of chips, but I was there, it felt so uncomfortable. I couldn't finish the bag of chips. It was like sickening in my body. Whereas for almost 20 years, it wasn't.
That so tracks with my experience, and now looking back, I didn't have that vocabulary of dissociated versus mindful or present. But what was pleasurable about it was the dissociation. It wasn't
Mhm.
the experience of eating, which is what I would have told you, like, "Oh, I eat my favorite foods." But then once you kind of get in your body and become aware, you realize, like, I don't even really like these foods very much. They're just what I associate with, like, giving myself a treat, which is really kind of giving myself a break from
Mhm.
reality. You mentioned shame earlier, and I want to come back to that because I don't know anyone who struggles with overeating who doesn't experience intense feelings of shame. Talk about what shame does in the body and how we can begin to shift those feelings.
Yeah, and I was just thinking, I just had to say what you said was so great about we do it for the dissociative result. That's really important for people to understand. It's why when you truly have a binge eating disorder, you don't even have to have your favorite food there. You'll find anything just to create the hypnotic trance. It's a trance, so you leave your body. So I just appreciate you saying that. And it kind of dovetails into that question about shame. The somatic purpose of shame is protection. So it's if I do something and someone shames me for it, let's say, relationally, there's like a potential threat. Someone's like shaming me for who I am or what I did. So the body's natural mechanism is to go into what we call a collapse response. And this is like what animals do when they play dead. So your head goes down, your shoulders might go up, you start kind of tucking inwards. Now, anatomically and for ancient purposes, you'd be doing that to protect your visceral organs from some kind of a blow. That's what the collapse, one of the reasons we collapse in on ourselves. But the other one, relationally and emotionally, is to become invisible. And so when you have binge eating and you have a really negative association, especially if it's impacting your health, especially if you become overweight from it and you feel insecure about your body or people are treating you a certain way from that, you're going to naturally want to disappear because it's so uncomfortable to be seen in that state. Not even the state of overweight necessarily, but the state of being dissociated and someone seeing it, right? And I guess what I mean when I say that is we dissociate because there's so much pain in us. So we're trying to escape from the pain in ourselves. And if someone else is seeing it or we're talking about it, we think we're talking about the food we're eating, but we're actually it's like code for all the pain we're in.
So I'm curious to hear what you would say. In my experience, the shame was already inside me and I just attached it to the binge eating. It became like the external manifestation of kind of the shame that I already felt inside. Is that the case for most people that you see or that you work with?
That's a beautiful question because I think if you already have shame for something you experienced already or something you internalized, then one of the ways you remediate that will be, in this case, with binge eating, and then it will just get projected onto that. And I think there's a secondary shame. I think there's a lot of self-shaming. So even if I already have shame, as I did too when I discovered binging, I already had shame from my life experiences and my traumas. And then I went into binge eating. But then I had this really negative, mean, hateful self-talk about the binging, which just created like secondary shaming as if someone else was doing it to me. So I think it works both ways.
One of the things that I think is so painful about binge eating or really any kind of overeating is a lot of people feel at war with themselves. I know I did. There was a part of me that like just hated that I turned to food, just hated myself for it, just couldn't understand why I kept doing it. And then there was a part of me that just needed it, just kept doing it. Y- Parts work is an element of what you do. How do you help people understand that there can be two very strong opposite voices inside of them?
This is why I love somatics, and I do parts work through a somatic lens. So when we do, there's another practice I do called the roots of your cravings. And that practice is especially what you're talking about here. It's specifically for feeling what's the part in me that needs this, that's looking to be remediated, what's the part that doesn't. And what tends to happen is the part that has the pain wins over because pain is so uncomfortable. So the body kind of reflexively tries to renegotiate, feeling that pain any way it can. It kind of prioritizes that. It goes into a crisis state. So I binge eat, numb that pain, and then my other parts that are like, I was fine, judge that part. And then we have this whole inner conflict of really hating on ourselves, which then creates a secondary stimulus of stress in the body, which then drives us to binge eat again. So the kind of closed circuit judgment of which in my opinion comes from not fully understanding the roots of cravings and binging is what then drives more of the cycle of binging because we're trying to remediate stress and our judgment creates more stress and then we have to remediate it the only way we know how, which is eating a lot of food. But when you understand the roots of your binging, when someone sits with that practice and they take a breath and for 10 minutes they're like, what's coming up? They get in touch with big things. They realize, wow, this started when my mother died. Oh, this started when I got in a car accident. I was so afraid because of the elections, whatever it is. And they start noticing, oh, there's an emotional component here. And that starts to invite a little self compassion because you're not just this person that should stop eating. You're this person that has complex, deep, unmet emotional needs. And you realize the food meets those needs. So people actually humanize themselves, to themselves just by being able to feel the root emotion of what drives their craving. The craving becomes obsolete in this conversation. We stop talking about it altogether and we actually focus on the unmet needs, just like my client with her husband. And when you focus on those and you start meeting them, your life becomes so satisfying and your life becomes your balancer. It balances your system that you don't need the food. The food becomes a beautiful bonus whenever you want to eat something delicious or nutritious, right?
So, one of the things that I think diet culture kind of perpetuates is this idea that, like, I'm a problem to be solved. Like, I have to fix this, I have to fix myself. One of the things I love about your work is kind of just a presence with whatever is here, and that's okay, whatever it is. Tell the folks watching at home what that looks like, how we can begin to make that shift in mindset from I'm a problem to welcoming whatever arises.
It really comes from a lot of practice and a lot of experiencing the shifts. Because cognitively, I can say to people, your body's going to have less stress if you don't judge yourself. And everyone knows that cognitively. Yet we're like, well, how do I not judge myself? What I find so powerful about somatic work and the way I experience it is really becoming the witness of the body's sensations. When you are the witness of your body's sensation, this really magical thing happens where there's your consciousness, the part that sees things, and there's your body. So you realize you're not your body, yet you're in this body, and you kind of create a relationship to your body. For me, that changes everything. When I thought I was my body, I identified with these behaviors. I hated myself for these behaviors, things I had no control over. When I realized I wasn't my body, but I could actually befriend my body and help my body, it became like parenting a child. Like the way I parent my daughter, it feels the exact same way. Something comes up, I notice a reaction, I notice a response, I notice a habitual behavior, and I get curious like, oh, where's that coming from? What do you need? It's more of a signal that my body needs something from me rather than I need to be fixed. I'm so identified with this.
I'm so glad you brought this up because I think this idea of witnessing the body is another way where it can become easier to notice the sensations that arise. So in the past, when I would feel sadness, it was like, oh my gosh, I'm sad. This is overwhelming. Whereas when I'm able to kind of take a step back, I can feel, oh man, there is some sadness coming in my chest. And it is, pretty strong. And
Mhm.
it's a little easier to feel when we're witnessing it as opposed to like feeling that's all that I can feel in my
Mhm.
body.
That's exactly right. It's exactly right. And if you think of the parts work, when I'm witnessing it and I'm realizing I have many parts, I stop identifying my wholeness with that state. So I stopped, like, I don't say anymore I'm anxious. I used to. I now say, oh, there's anxiety in my chest. That's extremely liberating and actually factual, because when you have anxiety, anyone listening, next time you feel nervous or overwhelmed or anxious, really scan your body and ask yourself, what are the sensations associated with feeling anxious? And you'll notice they're usually congested in one area in your body, relatively a small area too, like the center of the chest, the solar plexus, maybe just the face, and the rest of you is completely fine. Your hands are fine, your arms are fine, your legs are fine, sometimes your back's fine. So there's so many parts that are completely grounded and balanced. And when I can feel those parts while simultaneously witnessing, oh, my chest has anxiety, this shift happens that we call pendulation, where the body literally creates this inner modulation of swinging between my feet that feel okay, my chest that feels overwhelmed. And it's like mixing two different paint colors. They start to neutralize and shift each other, and something comes down. You feel your stress just kind of shift into something else.
As you're speaking, I'm just feeling my feet, which is usually my place of calmness, and just recognizing it's always here with me. Like, no matter what else arises, like, there is always a place inside us that's calm, and that's very encouraging. So, I want to ask you to dismantle one more piece of diet culture, which is kind of the way you think about food as a source of nourishment and support for our bodies, as opposed to the way I used to think about it, like, oh, it's this many calories, this many grams of fat, I should eat more carbs than this. How do you tell our audience, like, how you think of food as literally something that can be a source of support and co-regulation?
I really see food through an animistic lens, which means food to me is a living being. And it is. We even know this, this is a factual thing. This is even a spiritual concept. You see oat, for example, like an oat stalk, that's a living grass. It has information. It has ways it protects itself from being digested. It has ways that it has offspring. It fertilizes, it procreates. It's amazing. So whether it's a plant or an animal, these are living and once living things that have a ton of information in their bodies. And when we eat them, what we call calories and nutrients and such is just the personality and information of that food that then meets our body, and this incredible thing called digestion happens, which I see as a conversation. And so when we think of like a whole food, we think of the food as it was found in nature. You can cook it however you want, but it's how it was found in nature. It hasn't been changed in any way. Perhaps, if you're going to the butcher for a cut of meat, it's been cut, but it hasn't been processed in any way. So that food has its whole intelligence, and it's extremely nutritious, but it's less potent because it's whole, it's complex. So you don't get as much sugar, you don't get as many calories. You get a small dose of those things that's just enough to fuel you. And it takes a good like 3 to 6 hours to digest. So it's a long conversation. It's like a deep dive conversation the body has. When it's a processed food, it's what I call pre-digested. The factory is like the mouth and the teeth of the food. It's already ground down the oat in this case and turned it into an instant oat instead of a steel cut oat or an oat groat. Or it's turned it into oat milk, or it's turned into something which isn't inherently bad, but it processes it. And when you have this processed carbohydrate, for this example, the conversation is intense. It's like when you sit with someone who's talking really loud and really fast at you and you're getting exhausted. That's what's happening because you're having more calories than you naturally would if it was a whole food. So it's really the modern processing of food that overwhelms the body and then puts the body into a state of imbalance and impairment. But seeing it that way has really helped me ask the question, what do I need today from my food? Like, which foods do I need based on what I'm going through today? And it helps me have a kind of a conscious agency over, I'm using this because I'm going through this, and it builds my capacity to endure the experience.
Louise, before we go, tell our audience what you are doing. How can they learn more about you, the programs that you're putting on right now?
Oh yeah. So I would say right now when they listen to this, the next thing I'll be doing are my slow groups. So in January 2025, I have two different slow groups coming out. One is embodied practitioner, one is embodied masculinity, which has nothing to do with what we're talking about. So I think the best, but they can check it out. But I think the best thing for them to check out if they want to go into this relationship with food in this way would be my next 7-week course. Or next summer, I'm doing a 6-month slow group specifically on nutrition and somatics. But the podcast is a great start until then.
So we will link to Luis's podcast in the show notes here and just go to holisticlifenavigation.com and join his mailing list, and then you'll be up on all things Luis. Luis, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a pleasure to get to talk to you.
You too, love. Thanks for having me.
And a big thank you to everyone watching at home. I hope you enjoyed the program, and I will be back to you with a new episode in a few weeks. Until then, please stay safe and take good care. Good night.